Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Rice. I'm the membership coordinator here at Freedom of the Press Foundation. Wanted to welcome you to our latest membership event. This one is called 10 Years Defending Press Freedom, and it is on the 10-year anniversary of the founding of our organization. I haven't been here that long. The two speakers we have today that we have here today have been here that long. So I'm excited to listen to them talk about our origins, the current projects, kind of the trajectory of where they've come, and what we've kind of got on the plate for now and beyond. Um, Trevor led something like this over the summer as a private event with new employees, and that kind of gave us this idea to let membership know kind of our origin story, if you were. So without further ado, um, welcome Trevor, Rainey, thank you again. 10 years defending press freedom. I will let you introduce yourselves and talk about the last decade.
Thank you, Ryan, and sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'm here now. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. My name is Trevor Timm. I'm Executive Director here at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks for joining our membership program. As you all know, this is actually our 10th anniversary today. We are an organization that has some 30 odd staffers in the US and around the world, and do an incredible amount of work, whether it's building technology to help journalists communicate with sources or training them in digital security, documenting press freedom attacks in the US, or just generally advocating for press freedom in the US and around the world. It's hard to believe that 10 years ago, this was essentially a kind of almost a side project in which that we saw kind of an injustice happening in the world, and we wanted to try to fix it with this new organization. And so Rainey was right there with me, one of our co-founders as well. And so we thought we'd take this time to just tell some stories about the early days, talk about the problems we were facing then, the problems we're facing now, and just the amazing impact that we've had along the way. And so before I jump into kind of my first memories of how FPF got started, why don't we have Rainey introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her background.
Sure. It's so great. God, it's just amazing to think that this has been 10 years and that we've accomplished, like, wow, that so much has happened and that we have the incredible honor to be a part of this from the very beginning. So I'm Rainey. And my background was in privacy advocacy. I was a privacy advocate before I helped Trevor co-found the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and I also helped co-found and was heavily involved in the Chelsea Manning Support Network, working to bring attention to the prosecution of Chelsea and raise funds to cover her legal defense so that she could get a really robust legal defense without her whole family having to like mortgage their home or something like that. And through that work, I really got to know some of the other board members at Freedom of the Press Foundation, Laura Poitras and Dan Ellsberg. And then I worked with Trevor at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I was there for 11 years. He was there for a little bit less time. And yeah, we worked together on the activism team for EFF for years. And that's where we were when we sort of, the stories we're about to tell unfolded. So yes, I'm very excited to be here. So excited to celebrate this moment with all of you.
Yeah, so that's a great place to start. So so Rainey was actually my boss at EFF, the director of the advocacy team or activism team, and as an activist on EFF's amazing digital rights team, a lot of what I was doing was writing about press freedom, writing about the First Amendment, writing about Fourth Amendment and privacy violations online. And so this was right around the time that WikiLeaks was first coming into the public eye. And so, I think the idea that some people have of WikiLeaks now is a lot different than what it was back then. I think we have to put into context the idea that, we had just gotten off of two terms of the Bush administration and the post 9/11 world, where government secrecy basically totally enveloped the entire national security and foreign policy apparatus in the United States government, that was spinning out of control, that the government was running these outright illegal and unconstitutional programs like NSA warrantless wiretapping, which EFF was suing over, and the CIA torture program, and all sorts of other things. Right around this time, this transparency organization named WikiLeaks started publishing diplomatic cables and war logs from Afghanistan and Iraq in conjunction with the New York Times, the Guardian, and several other papers around the world. And as someone who had, worked for the old general counsel for the New York Times during the Pentagon Papers case, I was kind of well versed in the idea that the First Amendment protected news organizations or any publisher from publishing classified information. That it may be that government employees who sign secrecy agreements may be breaking the law if they're leaking information, but the news organizations that publish that information are protected by the Constitution. And all of a sudden we saw, and at that point, I think a lot of people had forgotten about the Pentagon Papers case. It was 30 or 40 years since it had happened. There hadn't been any large leaks since Daniel Ellsberg. And so what ended up happening was a firestorm erupted. All of a sudden there was congressmen calling on Amazon to cut off WikiLeaks servers. There was, all of a sudden their payment processing networks were being frozen, their bank accounts frozen, Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal, which at that point was essentially 95% of the online donation mechanisms that existed, decided to cut WikiLeaks off within 48 hours, despite the fact that nobody had argued that they had broken any law. And that we had thought that at EFF that this was really an end run around the First Amendment. It was really kind of the first high profile case of this financial censorship that I think Rainey can talk a little bit more about, since it's one of her areas of expertise. And so we wanted to do something about it. And everybody at EFF did, but we didn't know quite what. So we ended up coming up with this idea that we were, number one, we thought this was particular instance, no matter what you thought of WikiLeaks, was an injustice. But number two, we didn't want this to start happening to news organizations everywhere. Like if this became a precedent that this is how the government under the table essentially stops news organizations from reporting on its secret dealings, that would be terrible. And so the idea behind Freedom of the Press Foundation was actually a crowdfunding effort at first. We decided we were going to take on taking donations to WikiLeaks, but also a whole host of other news and transparency organizations that were really doing innovative things around transparency. So our friends at Muckrock News, who many of you may know, who filed tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands or millions of FOIA requests at this point. They make it easy for anybody to file a public records request. They were new at the time, and we had just heard about them, and so we figured we would help them. The National Security Archive had been around for years and did incredible work on government secrecy, and so we wanted to help them. The Uptake was this upstart local news organization that was doing really innovative things. So we, built this website was built by Michael Lee, our other colleague at EFF, and so we were all doing this on the side. Rainey and I wrote all of the copy for the website, all of the press releases, pretty much everything you see here and on our old site. But the kicker was that we, also were worried that maybe we would get cut off. This was Rainey, I'll kick it to you in a sec to talk a little bit more about the environment which we were operating in, but we didn't want to get cut off either. And so the idea was, let's get a board of high profile, respected individuals who believed in the cause and would make a ruckus if we did get cut off, and that hopefully these companies would realize maybe it's not worth the effort, the PR nightmare that may ensue. And so we were lucky enough that a lot of our heroes, from Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers whistleblower himself, JP Barlow, the founder of EFF, Laura Poitras, the amazing filmmaker, Glenn Greenwald, the enterprising journalist who wrote about government secrecy all the time back then, and the actor John Cusack, Jenny Jardin from Boing Boing, and a couple other folks really banded together so that not only that we could give this kind of a stamp of approval from some very respected people, but also just help us get the word out. And I don't think we ever could have done it without them.
Yeah, and just to speak a little bit about the environment we were facing. So Senator Lieberman, who historically has been one of the strongest advocates, in particular of America's war in Iraq, called on companies in the United States to stop doing business with WikiLeaks. And his staff literally called Amazon's, like the Amazon offices, I don't know how you call the Amazon offices, but his staff managed it, and asked them, are you going to continue to provide servers for WikiLeaks? And Amazon, 24 hours later, cut off WikiLeaks. And then he put out a press statement praising Amazon and then asking other companies to do the same thing. And he made a lot of accusations in his statement about WikiLeaks, implying that what they were doing was illegal, that it was criminal, that they had no right to publish these things. And there were big questions all of a sudden. I mean, I think there's a massive misunderstanding around the Espionage Act, in part because it's really vaguely written, but people were concerned, right? They were like, oh my God, am I assisting criminal activity by, basically providing services? So at the time, Visa and MasterCard shut off services to WikiLeaks, and shortly thereafter, PayPal, and then Bank of America. And it wasn't until later, like substantially later, that we had confirmation. Actually, the way we got this confirmation, is, as long as we're geeking out about this, is a partner of WikiLeaks filed an antitrust lawsuit against MasterCard and Visa for this blockade. And through that antitrust lawsuit, we got confirmation that, in fact, Senator Lieberman's office had directly contacted MasterCard and asked them to shut down access to WikiLeaks, which for me is just phenomenal. It's just unbelievable that, a sitting senator could call and ask payment intermediaries to shut down access to a journalistic organization, right, that was publishing news in the public interest. So that was sort of the environment we were facing. And I think that many people, it's easy now to forget that there was a lot of fear. I even knew advocates who were hesitant to speak out on issues related to WikiLeaks, afraid that it would tar them. There was a great fear that if someone set up a payment platform to try to receive any kind of donations, that they would face the exact same blacklisting that WikiLeaks faced, where they would lose access to their own payment accounts. Trevor mentioned, I've done a bunch of research into financial censorship. It is not unusual for when a payment intermediary is shutting someone down, to not only shut down the business bank accounts, but to shut down the personal, PayPal accounts for everybody involved, right? That's a very typical thing. We see it currently with a couple of anti-war news publications here in the United States, Mint Press and Consortium News, where they didn't just shut down the business bank accounts, but also the personal PayPal accounts for those. Anyway, I'm talking about modern stuff, and we want to talk about things in the past. And I would just say that, like, this was a time when there was a lot of uncertainty, and there was a lot of concern that anyone even speaking out, like if a nonprofit tried to set up and try to receive donations, which is something Barlow was suggesting that EFF do, that nonprofit could itself lose access to, its own payment services. So that was one of the reasons it was really a good idea to set up a separate entity that could really take on some high risk, advocacy in this space that was evolving and that there was a lot of questions about. So it was a really intense and awesome time. And, Trevor mentioned, like, this was in some ways a side project, right? Like, we both had full-time jobs at EFF. Micah had a full-time job at EFF, and EFF was gracious and delighted and aligned with us and wanted us to do this work, and also needed us to do the rest of our jobs too. So I think it was, I think Trevor said to me once, like, I figured out the way to do this is just to work all the time. I don't remember if you even, but I think it was not unusual for you to work all weekend long.
Oh yeah,
we
it
were
was
both
day
a
and
little
night.
bit. It was
It was day and
constant.
night. I mean, it was
Yeah.
very exciting, so it was okay. I mean, I remember, we were very nervous that we were going to get cut off by the payment processors. I remember over Christmas break, so this is probably just a week or two into us starting, I got a call from PayPal, and so I'm like very nervous. I'm like, oh my God, this is it. They found out what we're doing, and they're like going to shut it down. By the way, I should say, like, if Joseph Lieberman had decided to go to court to cut off these services, he would have been laughed out of court. Like, this just isn't a thing that is allowed by the First Amendment. But because he went kind of the back door way, or the back room dealing way, he was able to get what he wanted, at least temporarily. But anyways,
I still question if that was legal, but yes.
Right, and there is an argument that actually, by violating the First Amendment, he should have been liable for some damages. But that's another story. Anyways, PayPal called me. They had a few questions, but the funny thing was, the person on the phone was way more nervous than I was. They were basically like, please don't make a big deal out of this. We just gotta like ask you a couple like very simple questions, then we'll check some boxes and everything will be good. So don't go to the media. That was the implication, at least. And so after that, there was never a problem again. But so, we weren't just able to break this financial blockade. The good part was we got like tens of thousands of dollars to like a whole host of other organizations, tens of thousands of dollars each. So we raised hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars for all of these other news and transparency organizations too. Like Muckrock, it was basically their first $25,000 that got them started. And so, it was a wild success, almost more of a success than our wildest imagination. And I say that because, not only were we able to do what we initially wanted to do, the other thing that we had been kind of the other kind of like MO of Freedom of the Press Foundation was that we need more whistleblowers and we need more news organizations to publish those brave whistleblowers allegations. So not only do people need to come forward, but news organizations need to commit to publishing them. There was all of these scandals in the Bush administration about the New York Times holding the warrantless wiretapping story for a year after to hold it until after the election, which may have swung the election for George Bush. If they published that story, it might have gone the other way. So people were constantly asking for our comment. All of a sudden, like, journalists started being spied on. They're like, Freedom of the Press Foundation, what do you think? We started writing a lot about these issues. At the same time, little did we, and so the one thing that we were on before anybody else was also digital security, the idea of encryption, mostly because of our background at EFF. EFF has always been on the forefront of the encryption fights, even when not many people knew what encryption was. And so Micah, when he built our website, had put all of our PGP keys in our bios. And we were one of the only organizations that did that besides the EFF. And so little did we know at this time, somebody else was kind of listening to this message that we were sending the world about brave whistleblowers, and had contacted Micah to connect him with Laura, who connected, and then they all connected with Glenn to start writing some fairly explosive stories that would end up becoming kind of the one of, if not the biggest news story of the 21st century, which was the Snowden revelations. Micah, when this person first reached out, did not know the name Edward Snowden. But within 6 months, kind of our wildest dreams had come true times 2. And so, what are your recollections about that, Rainey?
Well, I think it's important, right? I think another thing that sometimes we don't talk enough about is how seriously we took the privacy and security of the donors who were giving to our campaign, right? And bringing up MiCA and encryption really brings that back, which was that we made it, if I remember correctly, and you can correct me if I'm inaccurate about this, Trevor, but if I remember correctly, the way we set up, especially the crowdfunding donations, it was like we were going to be able to, you could come on and you could indicate when you were giving how much you wanted your donation to go to each of the organizations, but then, and we would mark that appropriately, but then we were also making sure that we were not keeping track of like which individual person and tying it to their name was giving to which individual nonprofit, so that later when it's, you know, in the worst case scenario that the government came knocking on our door and asked us for a list of the people who had donated to WikiLeaks, we would be like, we don't know, we don't have that. We've set it up on our end so that we're not keeping a list of that. So am I remembering this correctly?
Yeah, no, it was a very clever technological thing that MiCA did. I mean, you know, he kind of built this website from scratch. Actually, if any of folks watching are Humble Bundle fans, this was actually inspired by Humble Bundle. You know, Humble Bundle had just come around at that point. It was basically, if you're not familiar with it, it's a pay for what you want site that sells video games, books, all sorts of things. Now, back then, I think it was just video games, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
And so you could also donate to charity with this pay for what you want system. And so you could use these sliders to designate, like, okay, I'd like 4 of my dollars to go to the developers, 3 of the dollars to go to Humble Bundle, and $5 to go to Freedom of the Press Foundation, and kind of like slide your mouse around. And so MiCA kind of replicated this very clever system for our website. And you know, it was a very cool thing that people could actually choose. They could say, okay, we'll split up my donation 4 ways, or you know what, I can choose to give it all the WikiLeaks or all the Muck Rock or anything in between.
Right. And I think it's amazing that we were capable of doing this because, you know, we started with nothing. We had no email list. We had no Twitter following. We were just viral, trying to reach out to the world and put up a website and see what happened. And we were just, you know, we were fortunate, I think, in part because we have people who are very strategic in communications who were on the board and were fierce advocates for what we were trying to do, including Trevor, who's just phenomenal. There's a very good interview, but also, you know, Dan Ellsberg and some of the other board members who were just really able to get the word out. And so from basically nothing from scratch, we were able to kind of tap into this moment where there were so many people angry about this blockade, wanting to support information getting to the public, but didn't know how to do it. And then
that's actually, I mean, it's a great point. It's actually why I think our organization survived and thrived where others may not have. You know, like it's hard to start. It's hard to start a nonprofit, but what it's really hard to is get name recognition and get people realizing what you're doing and get donors to trust you. And what we had was this board of directors who, you know, when Rainey and I started this, like they didn't really know us. You know, they were putting their trust in us. And you know, now we're great friends with all of them, which is awesome, you know, to get to work with your heroes. And but at the time they were, you know, putting their reputations in the risk for us, and they got our name out there incredibly fast. And you know, there was a New York Times article when we launched, written by the late David Carr, the wonderful legendary media reporter there. There was 2 or 3 articles in the Guardian, the Huffington Post. There was, by day 2, there was probably 24 articles about us. And so we went from, you know, 0 to 100 in a very fast amount of time. And we were very fortunate as an organization to get our name out there that fast.
Yeah.
And so, so all of this is happening, like, so, we're raising hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. All of a sudden the Snowden revelations happen with two of our board members and also the person who had built our website. Um, so we were like in the headlines all the time. Rainey and I were still working at EFF full time.
Yeah.
EFF had been suing over the NSA revelations, and so it was absolutely bedlam there, because all of a sudden this issue that everybody was ignoring for years all of a sudden was front page news. They had an active lawsuit around NSA surveillance, maybe more than one, or eventually had more than one. And now all of a sudden, when people find out who Snowden is, news organizations are like, wait, we have to take our security like very seriously. They had gone from not caring about digital security at all to seeing what the government could do to journalists, and how they can spy on anybody. And then all of a sudden they're asking us what they should do. And so this is kind of where all of a sudden we found ourselves with this amazing solution that no one else had been doing. And so, I think we should probably backtrack a little bit,
Right. We should talk about, well, I don't know, should we talk about the Manning transcripts too? Because I don't want to skip that.
Oh, that's the exact moment. You're right. So the same week,
they all happened at the same time. Yeah.
The same week that the Snowden revelations happened, Chelsea Manning was on trial for violating the Espionage Act as this heroic whistleblower who was going to be, unfortunately, sentenced to 2 decades in prison. And well, so why don't I leave it to you, Rainey, to kind of set the stage there.
I'll talk about that, and then you can talk about the life-changing conversation you had with Kevin Poulsen. So I'll leave that as a. So Chelsea Manning, I had been working on her campaign for years, and I'd been originally working actually with the Chelsea Manning Support Network, which I co-founded. And I remember I had been talking to them about trying to put together transcripts of her entire court-martial. And I actually got a little pushback, not because they didn't want to do transcripts, but because I really strongly wanted to have a neutral, accurate, readily available set of transcripts for people to be able to cite to. And they really wanted to put kind of an activist spin on it so that they could tell their story about Chelsea and why she should be free, which is an important story and a story I wanted to tell, but I didn't think we also needed, I think, a neutral, clear, it's a resource available to, for example, journalists who wanted to cover the trial.
Well, Rainey,
and Trevor can talk about this. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just interrupt you there real quick, just to say to everybody who, maybe either forgets or wasn't following this closely, like the irony was that, this was about, Manning leaking these documents to WikiLeaks was all about government secrecy and transparency. And yet in this military trial, there was this unprecedented amount of secrecy. So,
right.
In a normal federal trial, you might be able to access federal transcripts of the court really fast, or you could get a press pass, or you could sit in the audience. And what the government was essentially trying to do was shut out the media as much as they possibly could. They really restricted the number of media members that could sit in the courtroom. There was all sorts of restrictions on the amount of people that could watch. There was obviously no recordings. There was going to be no transcripts. They're like, we're not sharing transcripts. So unless you were one of the handful of media members that was allowed in, like, there just wasn't going to be coverage of this case, and it was a really disturbing fact to us. So that's kind of where this started. Right. So you can pick up from there.
Yeah, Trevor and I had been talking about, like, this was one of the most important trials of our lifetime, right? Especially from a press freedom perspective. And the fact that, like, journalists weren't going to cover it if they didn't have access to what was happening in the trial. And it's completely unrealistic for every single, journalist or news organization to send someone full time to sit in a courtroom and take notes. Like, that's just not realistic, right? And since And it would have been simple, right? Literally easy for the government to make video available of the entire trial. In fact, they were recording it, but they simply weren't making it available to the public. So I went down and actually was at, so I can kind of speak to what it was like to get into this trial. And there were, to get in, first of all, you had to have a press pass. And I think there were over 150 different press organizations that requested press access to the trial. I think only like 75 got a press pass. Freedom of the Press Foundation requested a press pass, and we were denied. We collaborated with 3 different news organizations. They asked for one for themselves and one for us so that we could send a transcriptionist in, and their second press pass was denied. So then we organized, Trevor actually organized a letter on behalf of a number of news organizations asking for the court to provide us with an additional couple press passes so that we could put in a court transcriptionist, and we were denied again. And the way we eventually got a press pass, I mean, like at every level we faced frustrations here, but the way we eventually got a press pass was Nathan Fuller from the Chelsea Manning Support Network had a press pass. He let us use it on the first day. And then going forward after that, we had 3 news organizations. It was like a German radio station. I'm forgetting who, and they donated us their press passes because they weren't going to be using.
Yeah, one of them was definitely Andy Greenberg, who's at Wired now, but was at Forbes at the time.
Yeah.
And so basically thankfully we were able to use other people's press passes. But the other kind of hurdle we had to get over was, when this trial was about to start, we were like, okay, first of all, we have zero money of our own.
Oh yeah.
And like, how do you hire court stenographers? We had no idea. And so all of a sudden we just we're like, okay, well, we've crowdfunded already, so let's crowdfund this. And, we're talking about crowdfunding and, it's not like we invented crowdfunding, don't get me wrong, but, Kickstarter was around.
Nobody was doing it.
Nobody was doing it back
level.
then. Not like today, when it's billions and billions of dollars crowdfunded for various things every year. But so, Rainey and I so we started raising money for it, and then we'd put out a call hey, does anybody know? I think we literally asked the internet, does anybody know any stenographers? Court stenographers.
We put up a job description. We were like, please apply to be a court reporter for us. We thought we would hire 2, one for the morning and one for the afternoons. And we were so wrong about what we needed in order to do this. We ended up working with 6. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, what were you going to?
Well, I think it ended up costing us $3,000 a day. Because not only we learned a lot about court stenography, which we did not know. So not only did we need to hire court stenographers, we had to hire the best of the best court stenographers, because in a normal courtroom scenario, a court stenographer can say, hey, Your Honor, I missed that. Can you have the witness repeat it? They can go back at the end and listen to the recording and fix any mistakes. They can do all sorts of things to essentially clean up and make sure that they are actually being accurate. And so we needed the people at the very top of the list who can literally just type a clean transcript on the first time around with no safety net. So obviously they cost more money. We ended up finding a company who, to great risk to their own company, decided to do this because they work with governments and in courtrooms all the time.
Right.
And, this was kind of like this guerrilla effort where we were, sending somebody in with a borrowed press pass, and they were going to whip out their machine in which they're going to start, stenographing. So it's this really amazing thing that came together at the perfect time.
Right.
And people were donating enough that we could pay $3,000 a day.
Right. I mean, we had originally hoped to be able to do it for about $40,000. It cost way more than twice that. And for me, this is such an example of we put out this call for court stenographers and, help us with this vital task. And there was a guy working at a court reporting agency who was a court reporter or court stenographer. I used to know a great deal the difference between the types of court stenographers. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the details now, but And he went to bat and he helped convince his company to work for us and work with us and make this happen. And it, to me, it's just such an example of, you never know when your particular skill set and your particular expertise is going to be useful to, you know, the advocacy and changing the world in like huge ways, right? This, you know, I don't think we would have been like, I remember interviewing one court stenographer. I don't know if you remember this. This was a woman who wanted to basically camp out there with her van, and that she was going to own the transcripts but license them to us, but we'd have to connect to her website. And we were like, absolutely not. Like, we're just, you don't understand what we're trying to accomplish here. You're not getting it. Anyway, just to summarize some of the physical barriers to getting in there, like, you know, it's on a military facility. So you had to line up. There was a long line of cars, and get in line, and your car would get searched before you could get in. You had to have certain type of ID to get onto the base. Your car was searched. So, you know, even long before the court would start in the morning, people would be lined up in their cars to get in. And then once they were on the base, if you left the court, you could not come back in. And you had to be there at the very beginning of the day, even if, you know, maybe they had a closed hearing when they first started out. So it's not like you would be sitting out in this little antechamber that wasn't actually, and then you would have to be physically searched going in as well. And it was interesting because we needed we wanted to do real time, as close as possible to real time transcripts. So we had a morning court reporter and an afternoon court reporter. They both had to be in and searched and there before 8 a.m. because they weren't allowed to bring one in at noon. And so it was actually, we got later, the defense was able to ask the court's permission to allow us to have a second court stenographer come in the afternoon. So we didn't have to pay someone to just sit there for 4 hours.
That was one of the most amazing parts too, was that, you know, again, as Rainey was saying before, like the court was hostile to this idea.
Yes.
From the very start. We didn't get fully kicked out. But then all of a sudden, like, this started getting media attention too. You know, we had this letter from all these news organizations, and then so we were releasing the transcripts for the PM session, we were releasing the next morning, and for the AM session, we were releasing the afternoon. And so we would have all these reporters who were just waiting for these transcripts. And if we were late by 5 minutes, they'd email us, be like, hey, where are the transcripts? I need them for my story. And so we were getting cited by like literally every news outlet imaginable. There's hundreds and hundreds of Manning supporters just wanting to share them and read them every day. And so when the defense made this motion, like the judge actually ruled that the stenographers were furthering Chelsea Manning's Sixth Amendment rights. And so from that moment on, this is probably halfway through, the stenographers were treated with a nice open door. And so, you know, to see that the judge actually ruled that that this project was furthering Chelsea Manning's constitutional rights was, you know, quite heartening.
Yeah, there was one day when one of the journalists who talked to us later about this asked one of the folks who was with the military, who was organizing the trial and who was setting up the media room, hey, are there transcripts that are going to be available for this? And they were eventually going to publish, I think, public transcripts. And the like official, you know, representative of the government who was working with the media said, oh, well, you can get them on this website, and gave them our website. Like, and then they told us about it later. I was like, okay, so the military is literally referring to us for their for the transcripts. And then and then the other thing is, you know, when we started Freedom of the Press Foundation, we were like, okay, we're going to defend whistleblowers, and we're going to defend leaks, and we're going to defend journalists and their rights, but we are ourselves not going to be publishing leaks. And how did that go?
Oh yeah, I mean, within a few months, like people were sending us leaks, like we were a news organization, or we were WikiLeaks. And you know, we did say, after saying many times we weren't going to accept leaks, we did have an emergency board meeting and say, actually, just this once we will. And so what was that?
So that was, if I remember correctly, it was when Chelsea actually testified at her own trial. So we received, and I'll, you know, I won't get into the details now, but we received an audio transcript of her testimony,
Audio tape.
which is amazing. Yes, not a transcript. I'm sending transcripts sometimes. Yeah, an audio recording of her voice, which is incredible, right? Because prior to that, really the only audio of her voice that was available was like somebody had posted an audio recording of her like voicemail. Like you could call Chelsea's voicemail and you could listen to her say, hi, leave a message. And somebody put that on the internet. So this was actually her speaking to what she had done, why she had done it, and basically pleading for mercy from the US government. And we decided to make this one-time exception. And I remember meeting with the attorneys beforehand and them saying like, okay, you should know that if you publish this and they come after you for your source and you refuse to testify, that's jail time. Are you ready to accept that? Like, are you willing to risk the possibility of going to jail for up to 18 months to protect a source? And of course we were like, yeah, we're willing to do that. Who do you think we are? This is like what we're all about. So, okay, it wasn't quite that easy, I have to admit. Like even the thought of like, I just really don't think I would find jail very pleasant, but we still ultimately decided it was the right thing to do. And we published it. And then Trevor went on the Today Show, right?
Yeah, we were like, again, this is how wild this was. We start this organization, all of a sudden we're raising hundreds of thousands of dollars. All of a sudden the source of the century is going to our journalists. All of a sudden we're on the Today Show talking about this leak that comes to us. It kind of all happened, within an instant. And it was incredible. And then there's like this whole other aspect of the story that we haven't even talked about. And so, the year was, we started in December 2012. And so this was basically the year of 2013. A tragic event happened in January of 2013, which is, the internet activist and all around genius, Aaron Swartz, passed away. He was being prosecuted by the US government. It's a whole, terrible injustice, which there's a movie about, The Internet's Lost Boy, which I would highly recommend. But he took his own life in January. Aaron had worked on all sorts of just incredible projects throughout his life. At some point, he had worked with EFF for a long time. A lot of folks from EFF were friends with him. And so this was just a shock to everybody. At some point, a couple months later, I was talking to somebody and was just talking about the fact that, WikiLeaks had kind of pioneered this idea of an anonymous submission system that whistleblowers could come and submit something online that wasn't going to get tracked like email or phone calls. I was like, well, why haven't other news organizations successfully done this yet?
Yeah.
It seems like a no-brainer to me. And the person was like, oh, somebody did that. Aaron Swartz did that. I was like, what? And this person was friends with Aaron Swartz and was like, yeah, actually the last project that Aaron was working on was an open source whistleblower submission system. And this was not public at the time. They hadn't released anything. They had been working on this privately. And so he had built a prototype. And so I ended up connecting with Kevin Paulson, who was the editor at Wired at the time, who was the person who was working on this with Aaron. And, we were just crowdfunding at the time. So I was like, hey, can we raise money for you to do this? And so we had a bunch of conversations and eventually, at this point we had raised a little bit, like people had kind of given us a little bit of money to stay afloat as an organization. And Kevin said, I'll donate the project to you if you can try to get this in news organizations. And so we were like, awesome, let's do it. Even though this is a dramatic expansion of what we're already doing, taking on a software project for an organization that has 0 employees. We had a little bit of money and we were like, this is the most important thing that a news organization could possibly do right now. And if no one else is going to do it, we are definitely going to do it. And so I wasn't even a full-time employee of Freedom of the Press Foundation yet. And so I sought out the only person in the world who actually knew how the secure drop prototype worked at that point. The project was actually called Dead Drop at the time. We changed the name to Secure Drop, but there was a third person that was working with Aaron Schwartz and Kevin Paulson's name was James Dolan. He was a computer security expert, and he had been working for the same company that Kevin worked for at the time, but he had moved on. He had just taken a new job, very high-paying job, doing security for a company in LA. And so I sought him out at DEF CON, and I was like, "Hey James, I'm Trevor, run Freedom of the Press Foundation. We wanted to see if you would come and help us make Secure Drop a thing that news organizations can actually use." And I was like, "We can barely pay you a living wage, but you would be able to at least pay your rent and hopefully eat, or at least eat 1 or 2 meals a day." And to his amazing credit, he was like, in like 5 seconds, he was like, "Yeah, I'll do it." And so James Dolan was actually our first employee of Freedom of the Press Foundation before even I left and started working full time. And so James was really the catalyst behind building Secure Drop and getting news organizations to trust us. And so within a year, on the year anniversary of the Snowden revelations, both The Guardian and The Washington Post launched their Secure Drops. And today we have probably over 80 news organizations worldwide using Secure Drop. Our incredible team at Freedom of the Press Foundation. Well over a dozen people work on the project. We help news organizations install. We train them how to use it. We constantly are upgrading software. It's in 20 different languages now. Basically, all of the major news organizations in the United States and North America use Secure Drop or have before in the past. And so, it's one of our proudest moments that we were able to take that project at this very critical juncture. It could have been forgotten to history if we didn't, have all these fortunate events happen where we found out about it. To see what it is today is hopefully we are making Aaron's, legacy and
James,
all the people who care about it proud, and James, who unfortunately has passed on since then too.
Yeah, I'm so incredibly proud of Secure Drop. I mean, I'm proud of literally everything that Freedom of the Press Foundation has done. It's just like awe-inspiring to see, like, on a daily basis, everything that's coming out of the organization. But Secure Drop, I mean, there's WikiLeaks is controversial. There's a lot of people who don't like them for a wide range of reasons. And one of the things that Secure Drop does is it kind of cuts out the middleman, right? Like, it kind of says, you can go directly to the journalist. Like, if you're a whistleblower, you can go directly to the journalistic organization that you trust, that you think is going to tell the story well, and give them the documents that you want them to have without risking your own safety in the process, right? And like, it takes the model that WikiLeaks was, pioneering, and it makes it available, kind of federated across different news organizations. So everyone has that potential and that power and that ability to connect directly with sources. And I think it's a new era of journalism. I couldn't have imagined that we would have done so much in such a very brief period of time to basically change the landscape of modern journalism and modern investigative reporting. And really, hats off to Trevor on that one, because taking on a complex technology project at that scale, when we were that small, my God, I mean, I had reservations, I will acknowledge that. But he had vision and he was right. And I am so delighted and thrilled that we were able to make that happen. We don't have that much time, Trevor. And I just want to make sure we do talk about some of the fights we're in now, because I think these aren't just historical fights, right? These are things there are modern fights that we're in today and things on the horizon that I also want to touch on.
I know. I mean, it's a great point, and I think Secure Drop and the idea behind it is the perfect segue. We were at that time, one of the reasons that put aside the Snowden revelations, even the reason that secure drop was so important in 2013 was because all of a sudden we started seeing all these reporters getting spied on by the Justice Department.
Right.
At that time, it was the Obama administration. There was a scandal involving the Associated Press, where the Justice Department had essentially monitored the records of 20 of their phone lines. A Fox News journalist was accused of a conspiracy for talking to a source within the State Department, and there were several other scandals as well. There was leak prosecutions under the Espionage Act were at an all-time high, and this was from unfortunately an administration who had promised transparency and had been very
Right.
inviting to whistleblowers on the campaign trail. It was unfortunately kind of a betrayal. It kind of became our expertise. All these journalists were coming to us, and we were kind of going out on a limb too, because this was a time, the Obama administration was, the start of their second term, but given that we had just lived through the Bush administration, there was frankly a lot of organizations that were hesitant to criticize the Obama administration, and we saw this as a grave press freedom violation. And what their Justice Department was doing was worse than anything we had seen towards journalists since Richard Nixon. And obviously, with the Trump administration, everything since, that trend has only continued. And so 10 years ago, we were talking about journalists getting spied on and saying that there needs to be not just technological protections, but legal protections. And
Yes.
Ironically, on our 10-year anniversary, we've never had a better chance to get those legal protections. There is a bill in Congress right now, which we have been furiously advocating for these past few weeks, leading the charge and trying to get Congress to pass it before the session ends, called the Press Act. Senator Wyden introduced it, and it is the strongest reporter shield law that we've ever seen. It is the best press freedom legislation that's come through Congress in modern history. It essentially would stop the US government once and for all, no matter who is in office, from spying on journalists and threatening them with arrest if they don't give up their sources. And, 2 weeks ago, nobody was paying attention to this bill. It had quietly passed the House and, got no media coverage. But we realized that actually, if this doesn't get passed now in this last session, it may not get passed for years or decades, just because of the way that the House is changing hands and the way the Senate map may look. And so we are putting in an all-out effort to get the Press Act passed really in the next week. You might have seen our new advocacy director, who's been leading this fight, Seth Stern, had a op-ed in the Chicago Sun-Times, and actually our longtime friend and board member John Cusack also had an op-ed in the Chicago Sun-Times, and actually, almost single-handedly, those two convinced the Judiciary Chairman Dick Durbin to really get behind this bill, and led his op-ed and his own op-ed in the Sun-Times with, I couldn't agree with more with Seth and John from Freedom of the Press Foundation. And so we are changing mind fast in the Senate, but time is running out. And so I would say to anybody who's watching this, if you can call your representative, you call the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, your own representative, tell them that we need to pass this bill before time runs out. It's a bipartisan bill. Republicans are not going to vote against it en masse. It passed unanimously in the House. And if it can come to a full vote, I'm very confident it will pass.
Yeah, I think it would be such an incredible, I think the thing we've kind of struggled with is the reason that we've needed tools. I mean, not the only reason, but one of the big reasons we've needed tools like Secure Drop is because we've seen these prosecutions where the Justice Department leans on journalists to try to get them to disclose information about their sources. And so we've had to create these technological tools, and this would, bring protections actually into the law. I mean, they should be in the law anyway, right? It's absolutely ridiculous that this isn't already legally the protections available, but now we could finally see that happen, which is just extraordinary, and hats off to the incredible work that Seth is doing to bring attention to this. It's just been amazing to see. And then
Absolutely.
I also think it's useful, I know we only have a couple moments left, but to just touch on, like, what do you see as a couple of other things on the horizon for Freedom of the Press Foundation, Trevor?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. So, one of the things we haven't talked about is that we have a whole team that does digital security trainings for journalists and filmmakers. We train over 1,000 journalists a year, well over 1,000 now, in how to protect themselves online. These are our colleagues, Olivia and David, their team led by the great Harlow Holmes. And this is a service that has never been in more demand. For all sorts of reasons, whether you're worried about your sources or you're worried about yourself on social media, we can help. The other thing is that, we now run, which I unfortunately didn't get to tell the story of that, its origin, but the US Press Freedom Tracker, which has become the hub of all press freedom advocacy in the United States. So we actually, with a small team of journalists that work for Freedom of the Press Foundation, we track every press freedom violation in the US. So anytime a journalist gets arrested or assaulted or denied access to a public event or subpoenaed, we actually write a full news story about it. And we track it in this, very meticulous database. So we can actually take a look at all, not just like individual cases that happen, but we can give you a full picture of press freedom trends, whether we're talking about nationally, locally, by state, by time period. And you can go on our new website, and actually all of these, you can basically create real-time data visualizations depending on what the information you're looking for is. So we are capturing the story, the individual story of each journalist, but also the larger picture. And so it's really become kind of the backbone of press freedom advocacy in the United States. And unfortunately, we've seen a record number of press freedom attacks in the last few years. And so, beyond Secure Drop and beyond our advocacy, these are the projects that we're pouring resources into, and that donors like everyone watching this, this is where your funding goes, and we honestly could not do it without you.
Yeah, I just have so much gratitude to the funders who've made this work possible, for the phenomenal team that is making this work possible. I mean, with the US Press Freedom Tracker, like, our calling attention to these issues and shining a light on them is holding, the government responsible. Like, if a police officer physically attacks a journalist, or if a journalist is sued for their work as a journalist, like, we're going to track it, and we're going to, call attention to it. It will not just be swept under the rug, and that we then become a way that other journalists and the public can directly find out about these issues. And it's like, we can never have an independent fourth estate without journalists being able to do their jobs, right? And I think of us as really the vanguard of making sure that can happen. So yeah, thank you especially to all the incredible donors who, make this possible. And that's its own form of courage, and its own form of changing the world.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to leave it. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we will pass the baton back to Ryan.
Thank you both. That was super fascinating. It was, for me, pretty unbelievable how much has changed in 10 years, and also how much has stayed the same. I think one of the things I'm most proud about with Freedom of the Press is the direct action component. The story about the stenographer in court, and I think in Secure Drop and our digital security team, we're really putting tools in people's hands to protect themselves and kind of keep the First Amendment protected. So that makes me proud to be a part of this team. But thank you both. We did not have time for Q&A. Feel free to send me a question if you do have one for Rainey or Trevor. I'm happy to pass it along. And if you're interested more in Secure Drop or the US Press Freedom Tracker, those are next on our docket for membership events. So look for those in 2023, and we'll dig a bit more into those, how those work and who's working on them. But thank you everyone for joining.